The wanted poster nailed to the post outside the general store in Caldwell, Kansas showed a woman with dark eyes and a defiant jaw, and Nelson Sheridan had been staring at it for a full 3 minutes before he realized his hand was no longer reaching for it. The year was 1882, and the summer heat pressed down on the town of Caldwell like a wool blanket soaked in dust. Nelson had ridden in from the north with two things: a near-empty saddlebag and a reputation he was trying to shed like a rattlesnake sheds its skin. For the better part of 4 years, he had worked as a bounty hunter out of Wichita, tracking men and women across the Kansas plains and into the territories, collecting rewards that kept him fed but never kept him warm. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that had been broken once and set slightly crooked, and eyes the color of creek water in late autumn. He was not a bad man. He had told himself that every morning for 4 years, and lately he had been believing it less. The poster said the woman's name was Violet Callahan. It said she was wanted in connection with the robbery of the Dodge City First Territorial Bank in April of that year. It said the reward was $300, dead or alive, posted by a man named Gerald Hurst, who described himself as a creditor and an aggrieved party. It said she was considered dangerous. It said she was approximately 26 years of age, dark-haired, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, last seen traveling southeast from Dodge City. Nelson read the description twice. Then he folded the poster in half, tucked it under his arm, and walked into the saloon. He did not go looking for her that day. He ordered a whiskey he nursed for an hour and watched the dust-covered travelers come and go through the swinging doors. He thought about Gerald Hurst, whose name he recognized from 2 different conversations he had heard in Wichita. Gerald Hurst was a moneylender. Gerald Hurst was not the kind of man who posted bounties for justice. Gerald Hurst was the kind of man who posted bounties because something had slipped out of his control, and he wanted it dragged back. Nelson was on his second whiskey when she walked in. He recognized her from the poster immediately, though the drawing had done her no justice and no harm at the same time. The drawing had caught the defiance in her expression, but had missed something else entirely, something that hit him square in the chest the moment she pushed through those doors. She was carrying a baby on her left hip, a small creature of perhaps 8 or 9 months, dressed in a cream-colored gown that had been carefully mended at the collar. The baby had a fist knotted in the fabric of the woman's blue calico dress, and the woman's arm was curled underneath with the practiced ease of someone who had been carrying that child for a very long time. Her dark hair was pinned up but escaping in several directions at once, and there was road dust on her boots and her cheekbones, and her eyes moved across the room the way a person's eyes move when they have learned that a room full of strangers is not automatically a safe place to be. She went to the bar. She ordered water. She asked quietly if there was any milk available for the baby. The barkeep shrugged and pointed toward the back, and she nodded her thanks with the dignified gravity of someone who did not have many options but refused to be diminished by that fact. Nelson did not move. He watched her settle the baby on the bar top, keeping one hand firmly on the child while she pulled a worn leather coin purse from her dress pocket. He watched her count her coins with a careful, unhurried precision that told him there were not many of them. He watched her shoulders, the way they held themselves straight even when the barkeep gave her a look that was not entirely friendly. He looked down at the folded poster under his arm. Then he set it on the table face down, put his empty glass on top of it, and ordered a third whiskey he did not particularly want. Violet Callahan, he had already decided, was not his business. Not anymore. He had ridden into Caldwell to look for honest work, wrangling or ranch hand labor, something that would put distance between himself and the life he had been living. The poster was a ghost from that old life, and he was done with ghosts, except that Gerald Hurst's men found her first. There were 3 of them. They came through the saloon doors 20 minutes after Violet had settled into a corner table with her water and a small cup of warmed milk that the barkeep's wife had brought out from the back. Nelson had been aware of them the moment they rode past the window. He had the kind of awareness that 4 years of hunting people had built into him like a second spine. He noticed the way they tied their horses, in a hurry but not too much of a hurry, the practiced nonchalance of men on a job. He noticed the way the lead man's coat hung heavier on the right side. He noticed that all three of them looked at the same spot in the room at the same moment, which was the corner where Violet sat with her baby. The lead man was big, not tall but wide, with a red face and a blonde mustache that he had clearly put some thought into. He walked toward Violet with the swagger of a man who expected no resistance and was already bored by the outcome. Nelson stood up. He was not entirely sure why. He told himself it was because he had never much cared for men who moved through the world as though other people were furniture. He told himself it was because the baby had looked up from its cup of milk with enormous dark eyes, and then immediately looked back down, in the innocent, trusting way that babies look back down when they have decided the world is basically fine. He told himself it was not because of the way Violet Callahan held herself, straight-backed and unafraid, even as three men walked toward her and there was nowhere left to go. He told himself all of that, and he walked across the saloon. "Excuse me," he said. He put himself between the lead man and the table. His voice was pleasant, his body was not. "I don't believe this lady is expecting company." The lead man looked at him with the expression of a person who has found a rock in their boot. "Step aside, friend, this is business." "I don't doubt that," Nelson said. "Whose business?" "Gerald Hurst's." The man said it like a declaration, like the name should make something happen in Nelson's face. Something did happen in Nelson's face, but it was not fear. "Never heard of him," Nelson said. It was a lie, but a small one. Behind him, he heard Violet make a sound, a quick, controlled exhale, and then the precise, quiet sound of a woman standing up with a baby and calculating distances. The lead man's two companions spread out slightly to the sides. Nelson noted this the way he noted everything, without looking directly at it. The room had gone quiet in that particular way saloons go quiet when everyone has decided to become very interested in their drinks. "The woman has a debt," the lead man said. "We're here to collect her." "Collect her," Nelson repeated. He said the words with enough deliberate weight that they sounded exactly as wrong as they were. "You're here to collect a person. She stole from Mr. Hurst. There's a legal bounty posted." "I've seen the bounty," Nelson said, "and I'll tell you what I know about it. It was posted by Gerald Hurst, who is a moneylender in Dodge City who has had 2 separate complaints filed against him in the last year for predatory lending practices, neither of which went anywhere because he has a friend on the county circuit court. That's the man whose business you're doing." The lead man's jaw tightened. "You a lawyer?" "No," Nelson said simply. "I used to be a bounty hunter, but I quit." He said the last 2 words with a quiet finality that seemed to confuse the lead man more than an argument would have. There was a long, poised moment in which the saloon held its breath. Then Nelson reached into his vest pocket, pulled out enough coins to cover his whiskeys and Violet's water, set them on the bar with a small, precise click, and turned to Violet. She was standing with the baby held against her chest now, both arms around the child, her chin up and her eyes steady on him. They were green, he noticed. The drawing on the poster had not mentioned that. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think we'd best step outside." She looked at him for a long moment. She had the eyes of a woman who had learned to read people quickly and had learned that most of what she read was not good. He let her read him. He did not try to arrange his expression into anything it wasn't. "All right," she said. They walked out the front doors. The 3 men did not follow, not immediately, which told Nelson that the lead man was reassessing and that they had maybe 4 minutes before he finished reassessing and decided his pride mattered more than his caution. Outside on the sun-hammered street, Violet shifted the baby to her hip and looked at Nelson Sheridan with those green eyes and said, "You read the poster." "I did," he said. "And you know what it says I did." "I know what it says," he agreed. "I also know who posted it." She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a soft sound and reached up to pat her jaw with one small open hand, and she caught the little hand gently without looking down, a gesture so automatic it had been worn smooth by repetition. "Her name is Rosie," she said, as though she had decided he deserved to know that. "She's a fine-looking baby," Nelson said. Violet almost smiled, almost. "We need to leave Caldwell," she said. "Now." "I know," he said. "My horse is at the hitching post on the far end of the street. I have a bedroll and enough provisions for 2 days' hard riding. Where are you headed?" She looked at him again with that searching quality, that deep assessment. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Nelson thought about that for exactly the time it deserved. "No," he said, "but I know Gerald Hurst's type well enough, and I know that a woman traveling alone with a baby and a price on her head generally didn't get there by choice." He paused. "Did you rob the bank?" Her chin lifted fractionally. "I took back money that was mine, that Gerald Hurst had taken from my husband and me through a loan agreement that changed terms 3 times after signing. My husband died before he could fight it. I didn't have a lawyer and I didn't have a judge who would listen, so yes, I went to that bank and I took back what was ours." She paused. "I took more than what was ours," she admitted, with the directness of someone who has decided that lying small is still lying. "I took enough to keep Rosie fed and get us somewhere safe." Nelson looked at her for a moment. "How much more?" $22. Something moved through his expression. He nodded once. $22, he repeated quietly. "And Hurst posted a $300 bounty." "He does not like being beaten," she said simply. "No," Nelson agreed. "I don't imagine he does." They looked at each other in the street, in the white-hot Kansas summer, while the saloon doors behind them stayed still, but did not stay still for much longer. The baby Rosie looked up at Nelson with wide, unimpressed dark eyes and then stuffed her fist back into her mouth. "I have a horse," Violet said. "A gray mare stabled at the far end of town. She is not fast, but she is steady." "That'll do," Nelson said. "Let's go get her." They moved quickly through the back alleys of Caldwell, keeping the buildings between themselves and the main street. Nelson moved with the practiced quiet of a man who had spent years learning the geography of places he'd never been before. Violet moved with the practical efficiency of a woman who had been finding routes through difficult terrain for longer than she'd wanted to. The baby remained miraculously quiet, looking around at the shadowed spaces between buildings with the interested calm of a child who trusted the arms holding her completely. The gray mare was a good, solid animal with kind eyes and a patient disposition, and she accepted the weight of Violet and Rosie without complaint. Nelson saddled his own horse, a big bay he called Jasper, who had carried him through 4 winters of difficult country, and they rode out of Caldwell heading south before the afternoon heat had reached its full fury. They did not speak much for the first hour. Nelson rode slightly ahead to watch the trail, glancing back periodically to check that the gray mare was keeping pace. Violet rode with Rosie settled across her lap, one arm loose but secure around the baby, the other hand easy on the reins. She was a competent rider, he noticed. Not showy, not nervous, just competent. The Kansas prairie opened up around them in every direction, vast and golden and indifferent, and the sky was the enormous particular blue of summer on the plains. In the distance, a line of cottonwood trees marked a creek, and Nelson angled toward it without discussion because water was always the right direction. When they stopped at the creek to let the horses drink and to rest in the small shade the cottonwoods provided, Violet laid Rosie on a blanket on the grass and stretched her back with a quiet sound of relief. The baby immediately grabbed 2 fists full of grass and began a thorough investigation of its properties. "Where are you from?" Nelson asked. He unstopped his canteen and offered it to her. She took it and drank before she answered, which he appreciated. "Missouri, originally. Came west with my husband Daniel 2 years ago. He had a dream about land in the territories." She handed the canteen back. "He died of fever last winter, November." "I'm sorry," Nelson said. He meant it. "Rosie was 4 months old," she said. He never properly knew her. She said it with the flat, careful restraint of someone who has cried that particular grief down to its bones already and is now carrying the dry weight of it. We had a plot of land outside Dodge. When Daniel died, Hearst moved on the property. Said Daniel had defaulted on a loan. I didn't even know about the second agreement, the one Hearst said superseded the first one. Hearst had Daniel sign it while I was in labor. Nelson was quiet. The creek moved past them with a soft, even murmur. The land was gone in 3 weeks, she continued. Rosie and I were left with a horse, the clothes on our backs, and $60 in savings that Hearst had no legal claim to but tried to get his hands on through a court filing that would have taken 3 months to resolve and which I could not afford to wait out. She looked down at Rosie, who had graduated from grass investigation to cloud watching with equal earnestness. So I did what I did, and I would do it again. Where were you going? Nelson asked. Texas, she said. San Antonio. I have an aunt there. Hearst's reach doesn't extend that far. Nelson nodded slowly. San Antonio was a long way from where they sat. Through Indian territory, through the nations, past the Red River and into a territory where the law was patchwork at best. That's a considerable journey alone, he said. I'm aware, she said, with a look that acknowledged the understatement without dwelling on it. He looked at Rosie, who had found a pebble and was holding it up to the sky as though measuring its exact opacity. I'll ride with you, he said. Violet looked at him. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly. I've spent 4 years bringing people in for money, he said. Some of them deserved it, some of them didn't. I never asked which was which as carefully as I should have. He paused. I'm done with that work. And I'm headed south anyway, and those men in Caldwell will regroup and follow. He met her eyes. You need someone who knows how to lose a trail. She held his gaze for a long moment. I don't need rescuing, she said clearly. I need an ally. Then that's what I'll be, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, but a kind of considered decision, the way a person looks when they've examined all the angles and found one that actually works. All right, Nelson Sheridan, she said. We ride together. Rosie, as though in agreement, held up her pebble toward him. He leaned over and solemnly accepted it, and the baby grinned a grin so wide, and sudden it rearranged his whole chest. They rode through the afternoon and made camp that night in a shallow draw that hid their fire from the open prairie. Nelson cooked dried beans and cornbread in the iron skillet he kept in his saddlebag, and Violet fed Rosie the last of the soft bread she had in her pack, mashing it with a little water to make it easier. The night came down warm and full of stars, the way plains nights do, and the horses stood quiet at their pickets, and Rosie fell asleep on the blanket between them with her arms thrown wide in the complete surrendered trust of infants. They talked. Not about anything momentous at first, about the route, about whether to go through Caldwell or around it on the way back south, which they agreed was through. Nelson mentioned a crossing of the Cimarron he knew that avoided the worst of the quicksand. She mentioned that she had a compass and that it was accurate. He asked how she had come by it. She said it had been her father's, who had served in the war, and that he had given it to her rather than her brother's, because he said she was the one who could actually be trusted with something worth keeping. It was said lightly, with just enough humor underneath it to suggest that it was also simply true. Your father sounds like an interesting man, Nelson said. He was, she said. He died 4 years ago. Heart gave out. She looked at the fire. He would not have approved of the bank, she added, and the way she said it made clear that whether he would have approved or not, she still believed she had been right. What would he have done? Nelson asked. She was quiet for a moment. Found a lawyer, probably. Fought it the proper way. She paused. But he had time to do that, and he had a name people recognized. And he wasn't alone with a baby in November with winter coming. She looked at Nelson with clear, direct eyes. I did what the situation required. Yes, Nelson said. You did. They were quiet after that for a while. The fire burned down to coals that glowed like something old and patient. An owl called somewhere in the dark beyond the draw. Rosie breathed her small, even baby breaths and did not stir. Why did you quit? Violet asked eventually. The bounty work. Nelson turned his tin cup in his hands. I brought in a man last spring, he said. Out of a town called Meade over near the Oklahoma border. His name was Aldous Pike, wanted for robbery in 4 counties. There was a good bounty on him, $150, and I had been after him for 6 weeks. He paused. I found him in a farmhouse north of Meade with a wife and 3 children. His wife had been ill for 2 months. He hadn't run anywhere because he couldn't leave her. He was feeding those children and tending that farm and sitting by her bedside at night. Nelson looked at the coals. He came with me without a fight when I told him if he fought it would be worse for his family. He asked me only to make sure someone knew to send word to his wife's sister who lived in Meade so she could come and see to the children. "Did you?" Violet asked quietly. "I did," Nelson said. "I rode back to Meade after I delivered him to the marshal in Dodge. I found the sister. I told her what had happened. He was quiet. It didn't change what I'd done. And the $150 felt like the most expensive thing I'd ever earned." Violet looked at him with those green eyes, and what was in them was not pity. It was something more considered than that. Recognition, maybe. The particular understanding of someone who knows what it is to have done the necessary thing and had it cost more than expected. "You didn't have to tell me that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you asked honestly, so I answered honestly." She nodded slowly. "Good," she said, with something in her voice that sounded like genuine appreciation. "I prefer honesty." He smiled slightly. It was a quiet smile, more in the eyes than anywhere else. "I'd gathered that." They rode for 3 more days across the Kansas plains. The days developed a rhythm that felt, to Nelson, surprisingly natural. He rode forward and read the trail. She navigated by her father's compass and the shape of the sky. They shared the cooking and the camp-making without discussion of whose job was whose, simply doing whatever needed doing with an easy mutual practicality that he had not expected, and that pleased him in a way he was careful not to examine too closely yet. Rosie was not a difficult baby. She was curious and cheerful, and had strong opinions about certain things, specifically about being set down when she wanted to be held, and about being held when she had decided to practice crawling. She took to Nelson with a forthright directness that was both flattering and slightly humbling, reaching her arms up to him on the second morning as though the matter had been settled to her satisfaction overnight, and he had found himself holding her while Violet saddled the gray mare with something warm and completely unfamiliar moving through him. He was careful. He was careful because Violet was careful, and he understood why, and he respected it. She was courteous and warm and occasionally funny in a dry, precise way that surprised a laugh out of him, but she maintained a personal reserve that was not coldness. It was intelligence. She was a woman who had been given several good reasons not to trust easily, and she was proceeding accordingly, and he had no interest in pressuring her out of that. He was also, very quietly, finding it harder and harder to imagine what came after San Antonio. The thing he had told himself, that he was headed south anyway, was not entirely true. He had no particular direction before Caldwell. He had simply been moving away from Wichita. But he told himself he was not thinking about that. He was thinking about the trail and the weather and Hearst's men who had almost certainly regrouped and would be following. On the 4th day, they crossed into Indian territory. The land changed in a way that was difficult to describe but immediately felt. The sky seemed larger. The grass was different, taller in places, and there were creek beds lined with older trees. They passed through the territory quietly and respectfully, staying on the trader's trail that Nelson knew, and that did not cross through the principal villages of the Cherokee or Creek nations, whose land they were moving through. Nelson had ridden through the nations before, and he knew enough to understand that the 5 civilized tribes who governed themselves here had their own laws and their own grievances with the United States government, and that a white man and a woman with a baby moving through their territory were not automatically welcome, but were not automatically turned away either, so long as they behaved with basic decency and did not pretend the land belonged to them. They stopped at a trading post near the Arkansas River, where a mixed-blood Cherokee man named Thomas Birdcall ran a small general store, and sold provisions to travelers. He was a quiet, watchful man in his 40s with silver starting at his temples, and he looked at Violet and Rosie with a straightforward human sympathy that had nothing performative in it. "You're being followed," he said, not as a question, while he measured out their flour and dried corn. "Yes," Nelson said. "3 men," Birdcall said. "They came through here yesterday morning asking questions. I told them I had not seen a woman and a baby." Nelson looked at him. "Why?" Birdcall looked up from the flour. "Because one of them hit my dog with a riding crop," he said calmly. "And a man who does that to an animal is not a man whose business I care to assist." He tied off the flour bag and set it on the counter. "They are about a day behind you. They are riding hard and they are not tracking carefully, which means they expect to simply ride you down before you reach Texas." Violet was standing at the far end of the counter with Rosie on her hip, looking at a display of ribbon and plain cotton goods. Nelson watched her absorb this information without visibly reacting. She picked up a length of blue ribbon, studied it for a moment, and set it back down. "Is there another route south?" Nelson asked Birdcall. "There is," the man said. "It adds half a day, but it goes through the Arbuckle Hills, where there are places to lose a trail effectively. I can draw it for you." He drew it on the back of a piece of brown wrapping paper in a clear and precise hand, and Nelson studied it and committed the main landmarks to memory. He bought the ribbon for Rosie's bonnet without Violet noticing him do it, and he slipped it to Birdcall with the coins when she was occupied with the baby, and Birdcall put it in the supply bag without comment. When they were outside and mounted, Violet found the ribbon in the bag and held it up with a look that was equal parts surprised and amused and something else he could not quite read. "Nelson Sheridan," she said. "Rosie needs sun protection," he said, straight-faced. She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, a real one this time, full and unhurried and genuine, and it was the single most arresting thing he had seen in recent memory. "Thank you," she said simply, and tied the ribbon around the baby's bonnet with quick, practiced fingers. They took Birdcall's route into the Arbuckle Hills. The land here was beautiful in a rough-edged, uncelebrated way, red limestone bluffs and cedar-choked ravines and little creeks that came and went and sometimes disappeared entirely into the rock. Nelson used every trail skill he had. He doubled back twice, rode through creek beds for distance, used a cedar thicket to mask their direction of travel. He worked patiently and without drama, and Violet matched his pace without complaint and did not ask unnecessary questions. On the second evening in the hills, they made camp beside a spring that came out of the limestone in a cold, clear curtain and pooled in a natural basin before running away south. The water was very cold and very clean, and Violet bathed Rosie in it with a small piece of soap she had gotten from Birdcall's store, and the baby shrieked and splashed with the delight of a creature who had been introduced to something wonderful. Nelson sat on the limestone above them and watched the light go gold across the hills, and tried very hard not to let himself feel anything significant about the image of Violet Callahan laughing at her baby in a spring in the Arbuckle Hills. He was not entirely successful. She came and sat beside him when Rosie had been dried and fed and tucked into the saddlebag-turned cradle she slept in. She sat at a socially appropriate distance, but the limestone ledge was only so wide, and her shoulder was perhaps 8 inches from his, which in the particular quiet of the evening felt very close indeed. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Something that has nothing to do with bounty hunting or tracking." He thought about it genuinely. "I can read," he said, "better than most people expect when they meet me. My mother was a school teacher." "Where?" she asked. "Abilene," he said. "She came out from Ohio when she was young to teach at a school they were setting up. She met my father who was running cattle." He paused. "She used to say she came west for the adventure and stayed for the stubbornness of the man, which she said were the same thing." Violet smiled at the sky. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," he said. "She died when I was 17, influenza." "I'm sorry," she said, and the way she said it was the same simple, genuine way he had said it about her husband, and it landed the same way. She left me her books, he said. I have them. Well, he paused. I have 2 of them. The rest I had to leave when I moved around. But I have her copy of Jane Eyre and a collection of Emerson essays that I've read so many times the spine has been retied with twine. Violet turned to look at him with a different quality of attention than she had given him before. Something opened up in her expression. Jane Eyre, she said. Yes. You've read it. 3 times, he said, slightly defensive in a way he recognized as not strictly necessary. She looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes. My mother read it to me when I was 12, she said. Twice. He looked at her. Something warm moved between them in the quiet, something that had nothing to do with the temperature. It's a good book, he said. It is, she agreed. I used to think Jane was too forgiving, she added thoughtfully. I was 12. I thought she should have left and stayed left. And now, he asked. She considered this with the genuine thoughtfulness she seemed to bring to everything. Now I think, she said slowly, that loving someone thoroughly is not the same as surrendering yourself to them, that you can love someone without losing what you are. She paused. I think that's what the book is actually about. Nelson looked at her. The light was almost gone and she was slightly luminous in the last of it, and he was aware of a feeling in his chest that he recognized distantly from a very long time ago, like remembering a word in a language you thought you had forgotten. I think you're right, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked away at the dark coming down over the hills and she said quietly, I am not going to be a foolish woman about this, Nelson. I know, he said. I have a baby and a price on my head and I'm 3 days from Texas and I am not in any position to be foolish. I know, he said again. Good, she said. And then with that small private smile, I just wanted to say it out loud. He smiled too, looking at the dark hills. Noted, he said. They sat in the dark for a little while longer before she went to check on Rosie, and Nelson sat on the limestone and looked at the stars and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something that was not exactly happiness but was in the same neighborhood, something that felt like the particular warmth of a direction. On the 5th day out from Caldwell, the men from Hearst caught up with them. It happened at a creek crossing in the mid-morning, when the trail narrowed between 2 red bluffs and there was no quick way off it. Nelson heard them before he saw them, the hard clatter of horses pushed to a pace that was not trail-riding pace, and he turned and moved his horse across to cut off the angle before they reached Violet on the gray mare. The lead man, the one with the blonde mustache, pulled up his horse 20 yards back. He looked angry and sunburned and considerably less cocky than he had looked in the Caldwell saloon, which was not necessarily a good thing. Stand off, Nelson said. He kept his voice level. There is nothing here for you. There is $300, the lead man said, posted by a moneylender to recover a woman he has already stolen a farm from, Nelson said. I wouldn't call that a clean bounty. I don't get paid to call it anything, the man said. I get paid to collect. Then go back and tell Hearst you lost the trail, Nelson said. It's the easiest money you'll ever make. The lead man looked past Nelson at Violet, who had pulled the gray mare to the side of the trail and had Rosie pressed against her chest, one hand over the baby's head. Her face was entirely composed. She was not cringing. She was watching with the clear eyes of a person who has already assessed the terrain and is ready to move. She's coming with us, the man said. No, Nelson said, she isn't. What happened next happened in the way things in the West often happened, fast and complicated, and over before anyone had quite decided it was happening. The lead man's 2 companions moved to flank, which Nelson had been expecting, and he turned his horse sharply to cover the wider angle, and in the brief confusion of positions, the lead man made the mistake of putting his horse forward. Nelson's horse, Jasper, had been trained well and did not spook. He held his ground and Nelson held his ground, and they were a wall, a quiet, complete, utterly unmovable wall. And the lead man's horse stopped 3 feet short of a collision, with a quality of equine judgment that suggested the animal was smarter than its rider. I'm going to say this once more, and then I am done saying it, Nelson said, and his voice had changed, not louder but lower, with a quality of absolute finality that came from a man who had made decisions in difficult moments and had learned that hesitation was a luxury that the moment rarely offered. There is no warrant in the Cherokee Nation. There is no valid warrant anywhere for a woman who reclaimed her own property. Gerald Hurst's name means nothing in this territory except to men he pays. You are 3 men on horses in the middle of the Arbuckle Hills, and you do not know this country, and I do. The 3 of you going back to Hurst and saying you lost the trail is the ending to this that everyone survives. There was a long stillness. The creek moved past below them, unconcerned. The lead man looked at Nelson. He looked at the 2 men with him. He looked at Violet, who looked directly back at him with the patient, clear gaze of a woman who was not afraid of him, which seemed to disconcert him more than anything else. "This isn't finished," he said. "Yes," Nelson said quietly, "it is." Whether it was the certainty in his voice or something in the arithmetic of the moment, the lead man turned his horse. The other 2 followed. They rode back north and became smaller and then became part of the heat shimmer and then were gone. Violet let out a long, slow breath. Rosie, who had been completely quiet throughout, apparently decided the crisis was over and produced a small, cheerful sound. Nelson turned Jasper and came back to where they stood. He looked at Violet. Her knuckles on the reins were white, which was the only visible evidence that she had been afraid at all. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, with a slight unevenness in her voice that she cleared quickly, "Thank you. They will probably not come back," he said. "Men like that are paid for results, and the result is getting too expensive." She nodded. She took a breath and squared her shoulders, and the white knuckles relaxed on the reins. "Then let us keep riding south," she said. They crossed the Red River 3 days later, into Texas, and the land was different again. Hotter and flatter with a kind of permanent shimmering beauty that was entirely its own. Violet's bearing changed perceptibly as they crossed, something easing in her, not loosening but settling like a rope that has been pulled taut for a long time being allowed its natural tension. "Texas," she said quietly when they were across. "Texas," he confirmed. She looked at him. "You have been very kind," she said. "I want you to know that I see that, not just what you did at the creek, but all of it." She paused. "The ribbon." He smiled slightly. "Rosie needed the sun protection." "Nelson," she said, with the tone of a woman who has decided to be direct, which he had learned was her default setting when she had made up her mind about something. "What happens now?" "When we reach San Antonio," he had been thinking about that. He had been thinking about it for 2 days with increasing frequency. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want to happen." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you want," she said. "Not what is sensible or convenient, what you actually want." He looked at her for a moment. This woman with the dark hair escaping its pins and the green eyes and the baby on her hip, and the price on her head that was becoming a fading inconvenience. He thought about Jasper moving under him and the plains and the 4 years and the tin cup and Jane Eyre and a compass that had belonged to a good man. "I want to stay," he said. "If you'll have me, not out of obligation or guilt about Aldous Pike or anything else except that I have spent a week riding south with you, and it has been the first time in 4 years that I've wanted to stop moving." Violet looked at him for a long moment. The sun was high and the Texas air was full of that particular dry warmth, and Rosie was asleep against her shoulder with the bonnet with the blue ribbon pushed slightly to one side. "I am not a woman who needs a man," she said. "I know," he said. "But I am a woman who would like a partner," she continued. "A real one, not someone who decides things for me or speaks over me or treats Rosie as a complication." "She is not a complication," he said immediately. "She is the best part of the last week." Something moved through Violet's expression, something deep and warm and careful all at once. "You mean that?" she said. "It was not quite a question." "I mean every word I've said to you," he said. "I don't say words I don't mean. It's one of the things the last 4 years were good for." She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved along the trail, patient and unhurried. Then Violet Callahan looked at Nelson Sheridan and said, Then let's ride to San Antonio and we will figure out what comes after that." It was not a declaration. It was better than one. It was a door opened by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and he walked through it with all the care it deserved. San Antonio in the late summer of 1882 was a city of considerable life and character, a place where old Spanish missions anchored streets that held German merchants alongside Mexican families, alongside newly arrived Texans, all of them making something out of the particular chaos of a city that had been four things before it settled into being what it was. The Alamo stood in its pale stone dignity on the main square, and the San Antonio River moved through the middle of things in slow green curves, and there were places where you could stand and hear three languages in the same block. Violet's aunt was a woman named Clara Voss, who had come to San Antonio as a young wife and stayed as a widow, and had built a life there that was quiet and sturdy and entirely her own. She was perhaps 55, with Violet's same directness in the eyes and a comfortable home on a side street near the river that smelled of bread and dried lavender. She opened her door to Violet with a sound that was purely relief, taking her niece into her arms and the baby from her arms in one fluid motion. And for a moment Nelson stood at the bottom of the front steps and felt pleasantly peripheral, which was the right feeling for the moment. Clara looked at him over Violet's shoulder with the particular assessing gaze that women who have lived carefully in the West develop. He held still and let her look. "You brought him," she said to Violet. "He followed," Violet said from within the embrace, and there was something in her voice that Clara heard clearly, because she nodded once at Nelson with a small firm nod that seemed to mean something like, "All right then. Come in," she said. "Both of you." Clara's house was the kind of house that had been put together with love and attention over a long time, not wealthy but deeply inhabited. There were curtains at the windows, and a kitchen that smelled of serious cooking, and a shelf of books in the front room that made Nelson feel immediately at home. Rosie, set on the kitchen floor, immediately began crawling with remarkable purposefulness toward a basket of yarn in the corner, and Clara watched her with the unguarded delight of a woman who has been waiting for a baby to fill her house again. Over dinner that evening, the three adults sat at the kitchen table and Nelson told Clara the full story of the poster in Caldwell and Hearst's Men, and Clara listened with the focused attention of a woman who was taking inventory of everything and filing it in the right place. When he finished, she sat with her hands around her coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. "What will you do about the bounty?" she asked Nelson. Not Violet, Nelson. He had been thinking about that. Hearst posted it in Dodge City. I know the circuit judge in that district. I know the one Hearst does not have a relationship with. I can file a counter-complaint documenting the predatory lending practices, the changed loan terms, and the legitimate basis for Violet's action. It won't erase the bounty overnight, but it will give it enough legal competition to make pursuing it significantly less attractive to any bounty hunter with a working sense of self-preservation. He paused. "And I can write to 3 men I know in Dodge who know Hearst's reputation and who would testify to the character of the loan practices involved." Clara looked at him steadily. "You would do that?" "Yes," he said. "Why?" Clara asked. "Because it's right," he said, "and because Violet and Rosie deserve to live without looking over their shoulders." Clara looked at Violet, who was looking at Nelson with an expression that was open in a way he had not seen before, something newly unguarded. Clara made a small, private sound and picked up her coffee. "You'll stay here while you send those letters," Clara said to Nelson. "I have a room at the back." It took several weeks. Nelson wrote letters with the careful, thorough precision of a man who knew exactly how much language mattered when it was going up against money. He wrote to the circuit judge. He wrote to 2 men in Dodge whose names he had earned trust with over years of honest dealings within an otherwise not particularly honest profession. He wrote to the county land office documenting the timeline of Daniel Callahan's loan and the terms that had changed after signing, using Violet's memory and a copy of the original agreement that she had kept, folded small and tucked inside the compass case. He had not known she had it until the second day in Clara's house, when she had pulled it out and laid it on the table with the straightforward deliberateness of someone offering something important. The copy of the original loan agreement was the thing that made all the difference, because it showed clearly, in Daniel Callahan's handwriting and Gerald Hurst's notarized signature, a set of terms that were materially different from the terms of the second agreement Hurst had produced after Daniel's death. It showed not incompetence but deliberate practice. It showed a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. While Nelson wrote letters and waited for responses, he lived at Clara's house, and living at Clara's house meant living within the daily reality of Violet and Rosie, and there was not a day of it that he did not find himself grateful for in a way he had no practice expressing. They fell into a domestic routine that felt entirely natural in a way that slightly astonished him. He repaired things around Clara's house that had been waiting for someone with the time and tools: a loose gate hinge, a section of fence, a kitchen shelf that had developed a concerning lean. He did it because it needed doing and because having something to do with his hands while his letters traveled the long miles north was good for his equanimity. Violet watched him do these things with an expression that she was not always careful to conceal, something warm and attentive that he noticed, and carefully did not react to faster than she was ready for. They spent evenings on Clara's back porch while Rosie slept, talking in the way that people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other, following threads that led to other threads that led to parts of a life they had not planned to share. He told her about growing up in Abilene, about his father's cattle operation that had done well until the drought years and then done less well, about riding out at 17 when the combination of grief and restlessness and not enough space became the kind of arithmetic that only the open plains could solve. She told him about Daniel, honestly, the way you talk about a person you loved and lost rather than a person you are performing grief about. Daniel had been kind and hopeful and not particularly cautious, she said, and she had loved him for the hope and had sometimes worried for the lack of caution, and the thing that had killed him, the fever, had had nothing to do with either quality, which was one of the specific cruelties of losing someone young. "Do you miss him every day?" Nelson asked, one evening when the question had been sitting between them long enough that it felt dishonest not to ask it. She considered it seriously. "Yes," she said. "But not in the way you might think, not the way you miss something you still want back. It is more like missing a time, a version of yourself that was in the world with him." She looked at the dark yard. "I think about him when I look at Rosie because Rosie has his nose and his way of looking at things, very serious and then suddenly very delighted, and I am glad for that." She paused. "I am not waiting for Daniel," she said clearly. "I want you to know that. I have not been waiting for Daniel for some time." He looked at her. She looked back, and the evening was warm, and the jasmine Clara had planted along the back fence was doing something extraordinary in the dark, and he said, "Then I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I don't know what kind of man I was," he said carefully, "before you made me want to be a specific one. I have not been particularly proud of my last 4 years. I have been competent and I have been dutiful in a limited and professional way, and I have not given anyone a reason to be ashamed of me, but I have also not given anyone a reason to be particularly glad of me either." He looked at his hands. "Since Caldwell, I have given myself something to do that feels like it matters. Those letters feel like they matter, and the evenings here feel like they matter." He looked at her. "You matter to me," he said, with the particular directness of a man who has decided that the right thing can be said simply. "You and Rosie both. And I would like to spend a considerable amount of time proving that if you'll allow me." Violet was quiet for a long moment. The jasmine was very fragrant. A cat that belonged to a neighbor made a slow, dignified passage across the far end of the yard. "I want to be honest with you," she said finally. "Please," he said. "I think about you," she said. "I have been thinking about you with an inconvenient frequency since approximately the third morning of the ride south, when you took Rosie while I saddled the mare and she fell asleep against your shoulder, and you didn't put her down for an hour even though you clearly had things to do." She paused. "You thought I didn't notice." "I noticed everything." He was smiling now quietly. "I didn't want to wake her," he said. "I know," she said. "That is precisely the problem." She smiled too, the full genuine one, and turned toward him slightly on the porch bench. "I have been trying to be sensible," she said. "I have a complicated life, Nelson. I have a baby and a bounty, and I am starting over in a city I don't know yet, and being sensible has felt like the responsible thing." "And," he said gently, "and I am tired of being only sensible," she said, with a directness that carried warmth underneath it like a current under still water. "Daniel used to say that I was the most sensible person he had ever met, and that it was occasionally a tremendous inconvenience, and I used to tell him that someone had to be, and we were both right." She looked at Nelson with those green eyes that saw things clearly and would not pretend otherwise. "I am telling you that I return what you feel. I am telling you that I am glad you came south. I am telling you that Rosie having a man who holds her for an hour so as not to wake her is not something I take lightly." He reached out and took her hand. He did it carefully, and she let him, and her hand was warm and steady in his. They sat together on Clara's back porch in the jasmine-heavy San Antonio night, and it was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was quiet and sure and mutual, and he turned her hand over in both of his and looked at it as though it were something genuinely remarkable, which he had decided it was. "I am not a man with much," he said. "I have a horse and 2 books and a reputation I'm rebuilding, and whatever I can earn going forward. I have a horse and $60 and a baby and an aunt with a spare room and a copy of a loan agreement that might yet amount to something," she said. "We are well matched." He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, surprised out of him, and she laughed too. And the night was warm around them, and Rosie slept inside, and Clara's kitchen light made a warm rectangle on the back steps. And Nelson Sheridan thought that if the last 4 years had been the price of arriving at this particular porch on this particular evening, they had been expensive but not too expensive. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently, questioning, and she kissed him back with the deliberate quality of a woman who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it, and it was entirely right. The response to Nelson's letters arrived over the following 2 weeks in pieces, and then all at once. The circuit judge, a man named Harlan Whitfield, who had come up through the Kansas court system, and was known for being inconveniently incorruptible, wrote back to say that the copy of the original loan agreement constituted substantial evidence of fraud, and that he was opening an investigation into Gerald Hurst's lending practices on the basis of Nelson's letter, combined with 2 other complaints that had apparently been sitting in a filing cabinet waiting for exactly this kind of corroboration. He wrote that the bounty posted for Violet Callahan was being flagged pending the outcome of the investigation, and that in the meantime he was issuing a written advisory that the bounty's legal standing was under review, which in practice meant that no reputable bounty hunter would touch it, and Hurst's hired men would have no legal backing for their activities. One of the men Nelson had written to in Dodge, a former marshal named Abbott who had crossed Hurst professionally twice before, wrote to say that he had known Hurst's practices were predatory for years, and that he was adding his own sworn statement to the record, and that it was about time. The third letter came from a lawyer in Dodge City named Solomon Pierce, who had seen the circuit court filing and written to Nelson independently to say that he had 2 other clients who had been similarly affected by Hurst's practices, and that he was filing a consolidated complaint that would likely result in the revocation of Hurst's lending license at minimum and possible criminal prosecution at maximum, and that Violet Callahan's name, far from being a liability, was now attached to a legal proceeding that was going to make Gerald Hurst's next several years quite uncomfortable indeed. Nelson brought the letters to Violet at breakfast. She read them at Clara's kitchen table with Rosie on her lap trying to steal a corner of toast. She read them once, And then she read the one from Judge Whitfield again, slowly, and when she looked up her eyes were bright in a way that she did not apologize for. "It's not finished," Nelson said. "It will take time, but the bounty is effectively dead. Hearst's men have no legal backing and they won't come after you without it, not here, not in Texas. And Hearst himself is going to have considerably bigger problems than you very soon." Violet looked at him. "You did this," she said. "I wrote letters," he said. "You kept the agreement. That was the thing that mattered." She looked down at the papers and then at Rosie, who had successfully stolen the toast corner and was regarding it with triumphant satisfaction. Violet pressed her lips together for a moment, and then she set the letters down and reached across the table and took his hand, and she said, "Thank you, Nelson, for all of it. From Caldwell." "From Caldwell," he agreed. Clara, who had been stirring something at the stove with pointed discretion, said without turning around, "I'm going to need a bigger kitchen table." Life, in San Antonio in the weeks that followed, was the kind of life that Nelson had stopped believing he could have. He found work at a stable on the edge of town, a good operation run by a man named Francisco Garza who recognized horse sense when he encountered it, and was not particularly interested in a man's history so long as his character showed up every morning. Nelson was good with animals and good with work, and Garza paid him fairly and occasionally offered opinions on life that were useful, delivered with the brevity of a man who had learned that most things could be said in fewer words than people usually used for them. He rented a room 2 streets from Clara's house, because it was right to do that, and because Violet was clear-eyed enough to appreciate it and he was clear-eyed enough to understand why she was. He had dinner at Clara's house 4 evenings a week, which became 5, and on Sunday mornings he took Rosie for a walk along the river while Violet and Clara attended church, which Rosie found absolutely fascinating, particularly the ducks, and which Nelson found to be among the most pleasant hours of his week. Rosie, who had been pulling herself up to standing for 2 weeks and falling back down with the equanimity of a scientist testing a hypothesis, took her first steps one Thursday afternoon in Clara's front yard, lurching toward Nelson with the wild, committed courage of someone who has decided that the gap between where they are and where they want to be is simply not that wide, actually. He caught her, of course, and swung her up, and she shrieked with laughter, and when he looked up, Violet was standing in the front doorway with both hands over her mouth and her eyes very bright indeed. "She walked," Violet said, "unnecessary and entirely necessary at once." "She flew," Nelson said, which made Violet put her face in her hands and laugh, which made Rosie look at her mother and then at Nelson with the interested expression of someone cataloging this new thing her family was doing. Her family. He heard the word in his own head, and it settled there with the completeness of something that was simply accurate. 3 months after arriving in San Antonio, on a Saturday evening in November when Clara had very transparently arranged to visit a friend across the city and taken Rosie with her, Nelson came to dinner. He had cooked, which he had been doing with increasing confidence since Violet had determined to teach him what she knew, and they ate at the kitchen table by lamplight, and afterward sat in the front room with their coffee and the comfortable ease of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together without it meaning anything ominous. He had the ring in his coat pocket. He had bought it 3 weeks ago from a silversmith on the main street, a simple band with a small inset turquoise stone, because he had been in the silversmith's shop for a different reason entirely, and had seen it in the case, and had been arrested by it with the certainty that it was the right thing in the way that certain things are simply right, and you know it immediately, and then spend 3 weeks working up the appropriate way to present it. "Violet," he said. She looked up from her coffee with the attentive quality that meant she had already noticed something was different about the evening, because she noticed everything. He was not a man who was good at speeches. He knew this about himself and had made his peace with it, so he said what was true, which was what he always did when the moment mattered. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be Rosie's father. I want to build something here that is worth building. I want to sit across from you for the rest of my life and argue about Jane Eyre and ride along rivers and be the person that Rosie runs at." He paused. "I love you. I have loved you since the Arbuckle Hills, probably. Possibly since the saloon in Caldwell, but I was trying to be careful." Violet set down her coffee cup. Her expression was entirely open, entirely herself, entirely the green-eyed woman who had walked into a saloon with a baby on her hip and counted her coins with the quiet dignity of someone who had not been beaten by the things that had tried to beat her. "I love you too," she said. "I have been in love with you since you accepted the pebble from Rosie and put it in your pocket like it was something worth keeping." He pulled the ring from his pocket and held it out. She looked at it for a moment, at the turquoise and the silver, and then she looked at him with those eyes, and she said yes, with the clean, unhurried certainty of a woman who makes decisions with her whole self. He put it on her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. Some things are simply right. Clara came home an hour later with Rosie asleep on her shoulder and took one look at the ring on Violet's hand and set Rosie down with great care on the settee and took Violet into her arms with a sound that was purely happiness, and then turned and hugged Nelson with the warmth of a woman who had been waiting to have family in this house for a very long time. They were married in December of 1882 in the front room of Clara's house, with Francisco Garza and his wife as witnesses, and a minister from the local church named Reverend Alcott, who had the pleasantly unhurried quality of a man who took weddings seriously, but did not feel the need to be theatrical about it. Rosie sat on Clara's lap throughout and studied the proceedings with her characteristic solemn interest, and then, during the part where Nelson and Violet looked at each other while saying their vows, broke into the enormous sudden grin that rearranged everything in the room, and Nelson looked at her and smiled too, and Violet looked at both of them and had to take a small, steady breath before she could continue. He said his vows clearly and meant every word of them, particularly the parts about partnership and honesty and staying. He had spent a long time being a man who moved on. He intended to be done with that. She said her vows looking straight at him in the direct way she did everything. And when she got to the part about love, she said it with a warmth that was entirely unperformed and entirely devastating in the best possible way. Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, and Nelson kissed his wife in the front room of Clara's house, while Rosie clapped her hands, and Clara cried quietly, and Francisco Garza's wife, a woman named Esperanza, produced a cake she had baked that morning with an air of great satisfaction at a plan well executed. Afterward, in the soft December evening, while Clara and Esperanza managed, Rosie and Francisco told Garza stories about horses with the animation of a man who has found his true subject. Nelson and Violet stood in the front doorway and looked at the street and then at each other. "Mrs. Sheridan," he said quietly. "Mr. Sheridan," she replied, with a smile that was small and private and entirely for him. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone coming home, and they stood in the doorway of their life together, while the December air moved through the San Antonio streets carrying the smell of the river and the distant sound of music from somewhere further down the road. In January, Violet found work as a teacher's assistant at a school near the river, a position arranged through Clara's network of church acquaintances, which was considerable. She was extraordinarily good at it, which surprised no one who knew her. The children responded to her combination of warmth and complete absence of condescension, with the immediate trust that children extend to adults who take them seriously. The head teacher, a woman named Miss Ellerby, told Violet in the first week that she had not seen a natural gift for teaching come through the door in years, and that she hoped Violet intended to make it permanent. Violet came home and told Nelson this over dinner, with the contained pleasure of a person who has found the thing they are meant to do. He watched her over the table, talking about the children and the classroom and the particular satisfaction of watching something become clear in a small face, and he thought about his mother, the schoolteacher from Ohio, and something in him felt that the world was occasionally given to a quiet generosity of pattern. "Clara says there is a small house on the street behind hers," Violet said, toward the end of dinner. "Her neighbor is leaving in the spring. 2 bedrooms, a yard for Rosie. The rent is reasonable." "Let's see it," he said. They saw it on a Saturday morning, the 3 of them, Nelson carrying Rosie on his shoulders while Violet and Clara walked ahead and discussed the particulars. The house was modest and somewhat in need of attention, and had a yard that was more enthusiasm than evidence, a square of packed earth with the ambition of a garden, and a kitchen with good light from the east window, and 2 rooms upstairs and a front room with a fireplace and a shelf above it that Nelson immediately and privately designated for his mother's books. "It needs work," Violet said, standing in the middle of the front room. "I know how to do that," Nelson said. She looked at him over her shoulder with the green eyes and the smile. "I know you do," she said. "That is why I am not worried about it." They moved in March with the help of Francisco and Esperanza and Clara and a cart borrowed from the stable. It took most of a day and considerably more volume of opinion than the volume of possessions warranted, and at the end of it they sat on the front step in the late afternoon while Rosie explored the yard with the systematic thoroughness she brought to all new territories, and the house behind them was theirs. "Well," Violet said. "Well," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. In the yard, Rosie found something interesting in the dirt, and held it up with the expression of a person who has made a significant scientific discovery. The spring of 1883 arrived in San Antonio in a slow green tide. The river came up slightly, as it did in spring, and the streets filled with the comfortable seasonal activity of a city that had been doing this long enough to know exactly how to manage it. Nelson expanded his role at Garza's stable to include buying and trading horses, which suited his particular skill with animals and his knowledge of the territory, and which Garza managed with the satisfaction of a man who has found the right person for the right job. He made trips into the surrounding territory periodically, buying horses from ranches to the north and selling them in the city, and he always came back within the time he said he would. And he always came back to the small house on the street behind Clara's where the lamp was in the window, and there was food on the stove, and Rosie stood at the door and held her arms up and said, "Duh," with the comfortable certainty of a child who knows precisely who belongs to her. He had formally adopted Rosie in February, through the county courts, with the assistance of Solomon Pierce, who had made the journey down from Dodge for his other legal business, and had stopped in San Antonio at Nelson's invitation. It had been straightforward and uncomplicated, and Rosie Callahan became Rosie Sheridan on a piece of paper that Nelson treated with approximately the same reverence as his mother's books. Pierce had also brought news. Gerald Hurst's lending license had been revoked in January, and he was facing 2 separate civil suits and a criminal fraud investigation, and had apparently left Dodge City for parts unknown, which was generally understood to mean that he had made himself scarce before the full weight of his accumulated decisions arrived on his doorstep. The bounty on Violet had been officially vacated as part of the court proceedings. Nelson told Violet this on the evening Pierce left. She absorbed it quietly, sitting in the kitchen with her hands around her tea. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't feel what I expected to feel," she said thoughtfully. "I thought I would feel relief or triumph. I feel mostly just," she paused, settled, "like a thing that has been undone can now be done differently." "That's a good way to feel," he said. She looked at him. "Daniel would have wanted this," she said. "He would have wanted the accounting. He would have wanted Rosie to grow up without a shadow over her name." "She will," Nelson said. "She does." Violet reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "He would have liked you," she said. "He trusted people who were honest about what they had done wrong. He was that way himself." "Then I'll try to deserve the comparison," Nelson said. That summer, Violet told him she was expecting. She told him on a June evening in the kitchen, with the directness she brought to everything, looking at him with those green eyes that saw everything clearly, and the careful, wondering quality underneath it of someone holding something new and astonishing. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms and held her, and felt her arms come around him, and they stood there in the kitchen in the June heat, while the evening came down outside, and the mockingbirds did their elaborate dusk performance in the yard, and he thought that the world was, on balance, very good. Rosie, who had been sitting on the floor with a set of wooden blocks, looked up at them standing there being unbearably content, considered the situation, and went back to her blocks with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has decided that the adults are probably fine. The baby came in February of 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright over San Antonio, and the river was running quietly 2 streets over. It was a boy, solid and loud, with Nelson's crooked jaw already suggested in the set of his face and Violet's dark hair. They named him James Daniel Sheridan, the Daniel for Daniel Callahan because it was right, and because the boy who had died of fever in November deserved to be remembered in the names of living things, and because Violet had looked at her husband and said the name quietly in the lamplight after the baby was cleaned and wrapped and placed in Nelson's arms, and Nelson had said yes without hesitation. Rosie, who was 2 years old by now and had opinions about most things, examined James Daniel with extreme suspicion for approximately 3 days, and then adopted him with the sudden completeness that toddlers bring to decisions, positioning herself as an authority on the baby and his needs that she maintained with remarkable consistency going forward. Clara came every morning for the first 2 weeks and made breakfast and held James Daniel, and told both Nelson and Violet with great authority that they were doing everything correctly and also several things incorrectly, and they listened to all of it with the love and occasional selective hearing that the advice of family warrants. Garza gave Nelson 3 days off and then on the 4th morning appeared at the door with Esperanza, who had brought food and also the unspoken intention of holding the baby, which she achieved within 2 minutes and showed no signs of relinquishing for quite some time. It was a good winter, that winter of 1884. The house was full in a way that houses are full when they are being lived in rather than occupied, full of the noise and warmth and particular entropy of a family that is in the middle of its own ongoing creation. Nelson woke early every morning and made coffee, and stood in the kitchen in the dark before anyone else stirred, and was quietly grateful with the thorough gratitude of a man who knows what the alternative looked like. He worked hard at the stable, and built the horse trading operation into something that had real standing in the city. He began to develop a reputation for knowing which animals were worth their price and which weren't, which is a more complex judgment than it sounds, and one that requires as much reading of people as animals. Garza talked occasionally, in his economical way, about partnership. Nelson listened and did not rush the conversation, because good things should not be rushed. Violet was promoted at the school. Miss Ellerby, who had decided to retire at the end of the 1883 school year, had spent the last months of her tenure systematically ensuring that Violet was prepared to take over the primary classroom. Violet took it with the contained pleasure and absolute commitment she brought to everything she decided to do. She was a remarkable teacher. Her students, who ranged from 6 to 12 years of age, would have followed her into the territories, which she would not have allowed but which said something important about the nature of her teaching. She rode to school on the gray mare, who was aging comfortably and deserved the light duty of a 6-block commute, and came home in the late afternoon with the particular quality of energy that people have when they have spent the day doing something that matters to them. She told Nelson about her students with the same attention and warmth she brought to her own children, and he listened in the evenings after the children were asleep with the contentment of a man for whom listening is a pleasure rather than an obligation. They had been in the house on the street behind Clara's for 2 years when Nelson and Garza formalized the partnership, in the spring of 1885, in a brief signing ceremony in the stable office that was attended by Francisco Garza's extended family to a degree that surprised and thoroughly delighted Nelson. The stable became Garza and Sheridan, and Nelson took on the expanded responsibility with the care of a man who understands that what he is building is not for himself alone. On a Sunday afternoon in May of 1885, when the spring in San Antonio was doing its most convincing argument for the absolute superiority of May as a month, Nelson was sitting on the front step of the house with James Daniel on his lap, who had turned 1 in February, and had recently discovered walking with the same committed plunge that Rosie had demonstrated, which Nelson was beginning to understand was a Sheridan trait distributed without prejudice of origin. Violet came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, and they sat in the May afternoon while the children occupied themselves in the yard, Rosie explaining something very complicated to James Daniel, who was attending to her with the serious expression of a boy who respects his sister's authority even when he does not fully comprehend it. "I had a letter from Abbott," Nelson said. He had mentioned the former marshal before. Violet knew the name. "What does he say?" she asked. "Hearst turned up in Denver. He is trying to establish himself as a property broker." Nelson paused. "Abbott says it is worth knowing, not as a threat, as information." Violet looked at the yard, at their children in the May afternoon. "He is not our concern anymore," she said, not dismissively, with the clarity of a woman who knows where her attention belongs. "No," Nelson agreed. "He is not." She leaned against him in the way she did when they were alone together, easy and natural, and he put his arm around her and she fit there the way she always had, perfectly and without effort. "Rosie asked me this morning where we came from," she said. "What did you tell her?" Nelson asked. "I told her Kansas," Violet said. "I told her we rode south and found Texas and that it was the best thing we ever did." He smiled. "Is that all you told her?" "She is 3, Violet said. "I will tell her the rest when she is older." She paused. "I will tell her that her mother was stubborn and foolish and right about the important things, and that a man in a saloon decided not to mind his own business, which was the second best decision anyone had made for a very long time." "Second best," he said. "The best was mine," she said serenely. "Taking that money, getting on the horse, riding south." He laughed. She laughed. In the yard, Rosie looked up at the sound of her parents, laughing with the pure, satisfied expression of a child whose world is arranged to her liking. Nelson looked at his wife, this woman with the green eyes and the dark hair and the compass that had belonged to her father, and the copy of a loan agreement that had changed everything, and the directness and the warmth, and the habit of being completely and absolutely herself in every circumstance. He looked at his children in the May yard. He looked at the house behind them, with the books on the shelf above the fireplace, his mother's Jane Eyre and the Emerson, and several others now, including 2 that Violet had added, and a collection of stories that he had bought for Rosie from a bookshop on the main street. He thought about the poster nailed to the post outside the general store in Caldwell. He thought about his hand, not reaching for it. He thought about what it meant to stop being one thing and become another, the particular kind of courage that required, which was not the dramatic kind, not the kind where you ride toward gunfire, but the quieter kind where you simply do not pick up the poster, and then you stand up in the saloon, and then you walk into the middle of something without knowing where it ends, but knowing what it is. He thought about Violet saying, "I am not going to be a foolish woman about this, Nelson," and about how she had been right, and about how being careful and being brave and being in love were not 3 different things but 3 expressions of the same serious, considered, wholehearted engagement with what mattered. The afternoon moved through its warmth, slow and golden, and the river 2 streets over moved with it, and San Antonio went about the comfortable business of a Saturday in May. And Nelson Sheridan sat on his front step with his wife beside him and his children in the yard and the whole wide southern sky overhead, and was, in the most complete and unpretentious sense of the word, home. Clara came for dinner that evening, as she did most Sundays, and brought a pie that she said was peach, but that Nelson had learned was peach, and a secret quantity of something else that she would not name, but which made it significantly better than plain peach. She sat at the head of the table and made assessments of the soup with the authority of a woman who had earned that authority through 30 years of soup, and Rosie sat next to her and attempted to replicate her assessment with the grave professionalism of a 3-year-old who has decided her gratin is the standard to meet. James Daniel threw a piece of bread and was gently corrected by his father, and then looked at Nelson with the enormous brown eyes and the exact expression of a person who knows they have done a thing and is waiting to see how much it matters, which was a look Nelson was finding increasingly difficult to be stern about, which Violet had informed him was a problem he needed to address before the boy was 12. After dinner, after the children were put to bed with all the ceremony that required, and after Clara had gone home with her empty pie dish and her satisfied expression, Nelson and Violet sat by the fireplace in the front room where the books were on the shelf, and the fire was low and warm, and the house was quiet around them with the particular inhabited quiet of a house where children are sleeping and the day is complete. He reached over and took her hand, as he did. She turned her hand in his as she did. "Tell me something good," she said. It was something she asked sometimes in the evenings, and he always had an answer. "Garza wants to expand the operation next year," he said. "Take on 2 more hands and start breeding as well as trading. He says the city is growing fast enough that the demand will be there." "That is good," she said. "What else?" "Miss Porter told me this morning that Rosie has started teaching the younger children their letters," he said. "Apparently Rosie has set up a small school in the corner of the yard and is conducting it with considerable discipline." Violet put her free hand over her face and made a sound that was equally delight and a mother's weary recognition of inevitability. "She is absolutely her father's daughter," she said. "He taught himself to read law books at 6. "She is her mother's daughter," Nelson said firmly. "She has the same look you get when something needs to be organized and you have decided you are the person to do it." Violet smiled at the fire. "She is ours," she said simply. "She is ours," he agreed. The fire settled into its coals. The May night outside was warm, and the jasmine that had come with the house was doing its fragrant best through the open window, and the street was quiet, and the river was 2 streets away doing what the river did, and somewhere in the city a horse was making the patient noise of a horse comfortable in its stable, and Nelson Sheridan sat with his wife's hand in his in the fire-lit front room of their house in San Antonio and thought about Caldwell, about the white-hot Kansas summer and the saloon and the poster he had not picked up and the green eyes across the room. And he thought that the man who had stood in that street with a folded poster under his arm and not quite enough direction had, by deciding to stop and turn and walk through a different door, built something he had not known he was capable of building, and that it was very, very good. Violet turned to look at him in the firelight with those eyes that saw everything and did not pretend otherwise, and she said, "You are thinking very loudly." "I was thinking," he said, "about Caldwell." "What about it?" "About how close it was," he said, "to being different if I had picked up the poster, if I had not stood up in the saloon." He paused. "If you had gone to a different saloon." She looked at him for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that some things are very close to being different but are also somehow very unlikely to actually be different, because the people involved are the people they are." She paused. "You would not have picked up the poster, Nelson, not that day. I think you had already decided who you were going to be before I walked through the door." He thought about that. "Maybe," he said. "I am certain of it," she said, with the quiet authority she brought to the things she was certain of, which were many and well chosen. "You were already not a bounty hunter. You just hadn't said it out loud yet." He looked at her. He thought about the 4 years and the poster and the tin cup on the table. He thought about Aldous Pike. He thought about his mother's books and the trail south and the Arbuckle Hills, and a ring with a turquoise stone, and a boy named James Daniel and a girl who was currently running a school in the yard. "You are probably right," he said. "I usually am," she said, and smiled at him with the full genuine smile that had been rearranging his world since the first time she had used it. And he leaned over and kissed her in the firelight, and she kissed him back. And the house was warm, and the children were sleeping, and the river was running, and the May night was full of jasmine. And everything that needed to be was exactly where it was supposed to be, settled and sure, and going forward together into all the good years that were still to come.